Hi everyone, Dr. Samantha Catrera here from the Imagining a New We video blog, a video series designed to help history teachers and other history educators teach history in ways that are more meaningful, transformative, and inclusive for their students. I'm in black today, which means that we're doing another Source Saturday video. I just thought black would blend in better than my bright outfits. It's also a lot easier to choose outfits when I'm like, oh right, the Source Saturday ones, I'll just be in black. That'll be easy, but I can switch out my glasses. The Source Saturday series is a series designed to connect you with primary sources, but also with historians to talk about those primary sources, to model for you ways that historians use primary sources, but also how we can challenge our traditional grand narratives of Canadian history with these different sources. And what's interesting is that I kind of wanted to start the series by talking about the Spanish flu. And so I put out a couple calls on Twitter and I didn't really get a lot of feedback. I mean, we did start last year with cookbooks because of Rosh Hashanah, or last week, which I thought was really cool. But it was interesting because that no one is really looking at least on the Twitterverse, no one's really looking at education and Spanish flu yet. See, that's the thing. If you watched my first video with Neil Orford in March 25th, 2020, you'll hear me say to him, I've never really thought of the Spanish flu before the commemorative project 2 years ago. And he said, most people haven't. And so, these are and one of the things he talks about in that video is the cultural amnesia, why aren't we talking about these histories more? So when I put out this call, there weren't a lot of people that said, yes, that's what I'm focusing on. There are now. I do know that. I've talked to a couple people. But the person I'm talking to today, he was like, that's not what I'm focused on. But I have made note of when this has come up in my research and I'm interested in talking about it. And so that's really cool too. This isn't a key element of his research, or at least it wasn't. It might be now, but it's become that because of this moment, which just highlights things about, that's a skateboard. Maybe it's that same skateboard. I don't know if you watch all my videos, but I was doing a video and I was like, that's a skateboard making that, no, anyway. And I put a little animated skateboard up like I'm doing right now. Anyway. So yeah, he got in touch and he's like, yeah, I'm noticing this now. Do you want to talk about that? And I was like, yeah, let's talk about it. And let's also talk about the fact that this wasn't something that was people's primary research focus, last year necessarily. So today we're talking with Sandy Barron. Sandy is a PhD candidate at the University of Carleton. He did his master's at the University of Calgary, and he worked in developmental education for about 8 years. So he also brings that practical knowledge to his conversations. He is a historian of education. And so he has looked at schools for the deaf in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and the ways that deaf activism gets started, but also just kind of deaf education. And one of the primary sources that he uses are the newsletters that were sent to students' parents throughout the year. And so he pulled out a couple for us related to the Spanish flu, which I think is just really interesting. And what's interesting too is because it's a newsletter to parents that we get to hear that was a cat. Okay. We get to hear some of the students' voices, which is interesting because I know a lot of us in our classrooms right now are creating assignments where students can be more reflective of this period in their own lives. So I'm really excited to talk with Sandy. This is the first time we're meeting, which has just been such a wonderful element of all of these series. So let's go over to Twitter and, let's go over to Zoom and talk to Sandy. Sandy, it is so nice to meet you. Thank you so much for agreeing to speak with me for this Source Saturday. And I'm extra excited because you digitized these documents just for us. And so I feel extra lucky to have you here. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks for having me. Yeah.
Do you want to introduce yourself before we get started?
Sure. So my name is Sandy Barron. I'm a PhD candidate at Carleton University in Ottawa. And I studied the politics of deaf education in Western Canada from about the 1880s to about the 1930s. And the documents that I'm going to be talking about today, they come out of the Manitoba School for the Deaf. But my study is really about Alberta and Saskatchewan. But because those students were going to Manitoba, I have to look at them through that Manitoba lens because you use the sources that are available, right? So yeah, that's me.
That's great. It's so nice to have sources and histories that like are explicitly kind of spanning a few provinces, and like I think that's a really like rich element of this history. So thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it brings in something that a lot of historians don't tend to problematize, which is not necessarily looking at federal provincial jurisdictional issues, but like interprovincial jurisdictional issues when like with deaf education during the period that I study, Alberta and Saskatchewan didn't set up their own deaf schools until Saskatchewan in 1931 and then Alberta in 1955. So they sent their students to Winnipeg, but citizens in those provinces were always clamoring to start deaf schools in their provinces. So it's sort of like you can see this moment when deaf activists in the 1920s in Saskatchewan finally accrue enough power and influence to force their government to actually found this school during the Depression, nonetheless. So it's a pretty remarkable achievement.
Did you say the first school for the deaf in Alberta was 1955, like 55?
Yes, 55.
Oh, that's so late.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
That's a fascinating element of history I've never like even thought of. But then when those numbers are there, that's such a shock.
Mm-hmm. There were small private schools that would open and close for a couple of years in Edmonton and in Calgary, but deaf students in Alberta would go to Manitoba or go to Montreal, or actually more commonly not go anywhere, just be on the farm.
Right. Interesting.
And their education was just learning how to run a farm, and that's what they would do.
Okay, well, let's talk about these documents. Thank you so much for ensuring that we had 4 different pages of this newsletter to talk about. Our first question is, what is this source? So I've put one page up from December 1st, 1918.
Yep.
We can go back to another page. Can you tell us a little bit about this source or these sources that we're going to talk about today?
Absolutely. So these are snaps that I took at the Legislative Library in Manitoba of a newspaper called The Echo. And that was produced at the Manitoba School for the Deaf. And it started to be produced in 1892 and it went all the way up to 1940. And the reason that they produced a newspaper at the school was because many of the male and some of the female deaf students were being trained in printmaking, which was a pretty good, pretty stable working class job at the time in many Western Canadian cities. So it was practical training for the students. They would learn how to typeset, learn new technologies as they came along, and they would produce these papers, which is great. It came out bi-weekly during that period. It's great for them because, they learn practically what to do in a printing shop. It was great for parents because parents could check in on their children, and the children would sometimes write little bylines under their name about what they were doing. So you can see the examples here. This is the editorial page, which was usually the political page where the principal or members of the deaf community would write about issues facing the deaf community. Then there were like the student pages where they would just write about, we played hockey yesterday or whatever, it's snowing outside. And so it connected students to their parents because it's important to remember that their parents would have been far away. And these students went usually from September to June to often another province, but certainly another city. And they didn't really have any contact with their parents except for going home at Christmas. So there's this really important piece of distance between family members. And this paper was part of the way that the school tried to bridge that distance. It has those functions. It's also a really good source for emerging politics in the deaf community, which is what I was using it for before I sort of found this influenza stuff. And you can see the emergence of these political, these political. They start off as clubs and And then, sorry, were you stopping me?
Yes, because the cat walked in front of the screen and on the keyboard, and it just.
Okay.
But I'm glad it didn't bother you. It was just me that bothered you.
The cat here has been like put in a room because right before this started, he was like walking on the keyboard and trying to fight me. So,
All right, you're a better pet parent than I'm like, just.
I think I'm a worse pet parent. I think that's how that works. So as I was saying, it's really important to look at it as a good source. Like I use it as a source to look at emerging deaf politics. So the Winnipeg Association of the Deaf is founded in the late 19th century, and really it's a social club. They deaf folks get together in the city, play hockey, have tug of war tournaments with different like hearing teams, and they get together and they sign. It's a club for the most part. In the early 1920s, the Western Canadian Association for the Deaf is founded, and the reader can trace how it's founded because there's a notification that says like, we're starting this organization. It is going to be a political organization. It is not going to be about sports. We're going to fight for deaf education. We're going to fight for sign language rights, all this stuff. It's very super interesting. So this source, it seems just like a little school newspaper where people are, for the children and teachers for the most part, are just writing about, they're writing about home. So this page, News of the Deaf from Afar and Near, this is mostly just news from hometowns that the students get and then they print. And so it's sort of like this connection between the prairies, Manitoba, and the school itself. So it's a wonderfully rich source. And you could use it for all kinds of social history applications beyond just deaf and disability history.
Okay, so I have a whole bunch of questions about the political aspects or the political kind of group that you were talking about. First, is there a particular page that would be good to have on here when we're talking about this?
Well, with the sources that I've sort of selected here, it's mostly about the influenza pandemic. So that political movement, it does start around this time, but it's mostly about 1919, 1920, where you start to see that more political bent in the paper. But of course, politics is a very wide thing, and all of this is also politics, right? So politics is not just high dialogue.
Yeah, because one of the reasons why I wanted to bring some of that up is because I was interested in, like, I guess the age of the people that were interested in organizing, if they were graduates of the school, if they were teachers, if they were students, because one of the things I see a lot when I look at curriculum is like students need to take age appropriate civic action. And I'm like, what does that mean? Because you can be a 10-year-old and like be in a protest, and you can be a 17-year-old and you can start an organization. You can also be a 40-year-old and do nothing. And so I love this idea of being able to bring up the kind of intersection between like activism and politics and schooling. And so, yeah, we didn't necessarily plan on talking about that, but it's kind of an interesting element. Can you speak about that? And like the ages and whether it's the graduates, etc.?
Sure. So one of the reasons that I identify in my research for why this explosion of politics and concern with things outside of the school happens in the 1920s is because you have this whole generation of students that came in between 1895 to about 1910, 1914. And they're graduating at the end of the First World War, and they're working as printers or they're getting married or whatever, and they start to disperse throughout the prairies. They go back to where they came from. Because before the 1890s, there were something like 18 to 20 students. All of a sudden, by the turn of the century, you've got about 100. So there's this huge jump. And they go back and they form their own little community organizations in Saskatoon, in Regina, wherever, Calgary. And that's why in Winnipeg, there's this Western Canadian Association for the Deaf. It becomes a regional association because that's totally necessary. So this politics happens because there's a cohort of men and women who come out of the Manitoba School for the Deaf who are educated. Some of them have gone to Gallaudet University or Gallaudet College, which is the deaf university in the United States in Washington. And they come back and they are breathing in all of this emerging deaf politics from the United States around the issues of oralism and having sign language banned in deaf schools, which was happening at the time. And children were being forced to speak and read lips. And things like that, things like it was very hard for deaf people to get insurance, life insurance, or even car insurance. It was almost impossible. So they had to go to organizations like the Foresters organizations and go through some of those channels that regular working class people, like hearing working class people were getting insurance through. So, oralism, insurance, and also deaf driving rights. There's this huge campaign in the 1920s of fighting these laws, especially in British Columbia, but across the prairies, banning deaf people from getting driving licenses. And it was successful because, of course, deaf people should be able to drive. It seems obvious to us now, but it wasn't at the time. So when they're younger, and you can see this in here, they're not like younger students at the school aren't really talking about these kinds of things. I suspect it's because, they're in school, they're young. But it's also because we have to remember that this is also an edited page, right? The editor was deaf, so it's a deaf edited newspaper, but it's also a school newspaper. So, I'm sure that there were things that some students wanted to write that didn't make it into the paper for whatever reason, So yeah, that would be my answer, is that in the 1920s, you just have this politically active cohort that sort of comes together at the right time and in the right numbers to really affect change in the prairies.
Well, yeah, I was going to say that they might be talking about it, but we don't have a record of that, right? Like the students might be talking about it. And it's really interesting. I mean, it shouldn't be surprising, but it's always interesting to be reminded, I guess, of how ideas travel and how ideas travel because people travel. And in that one page that I was showing when you were talking, one of the reasons why I really thought this was, no, not this page. One of the reasons why I thought it was really interesting is because of how, oh, not that page I mean, they're all interesting. We'll get to that. Let me just get to the page I wanted. Maybe it's this one. Yeah, I think this is the near and far page. One of the reasons why this is such an interesting page is because, like you are saying, it lists so many different places. Like here is Winnipeg, and then Toronto, and then Halifax, and then Massachusetts. And it really just reminds me of how these kind of ordinary, everyday sources that we don't think of as like the big ones that we might want to bring into our classroom because it's not like this speech from a prime minister, like how these little pieces show us so much about history that maybe we forget or we gloss over, we don't really think about, right? That there was this movement and that's how ideas travel. And, we connected because there is stuff around the Spanish flu. And, I would guess that you weren't really looking at that, in February or last year at all before it became part of the thing that we talk about. So could you talk to me a little bit about the relationship with the Spanish flu and these documents? Like, what do you read from these documents when, especially related to the Spanish flu and deaf education? What do you read from these documents, both literally, but then also kind of analytically or metaphorically?
Sure. So I became interested in the issue of the influenza pandemic because I looked into a different source that I looked at, which was the application forms. And I started to notice in 1919 to about 1925, I started to see a bit of an uptick in applications. And many of those students I found either lost a parent in the pandemic or were themselves became deaf by illness, by the flu itself, which was the most common cause of deafness was childhood illness at this time. And so I thought, okay, that's interesting. Wow, I never really thought about that the impact of a pandemic doesn't stop in 1919, right? It continues for decades or for lifetimes, right? And so I thought about that and I thought, okay, I'm going to go back to the Echo and look what was going on at the school in October to December 1918. And so I looked back and initially, so there was no edition in September, which is too bad because the school had actually the printing press, had been closed during the war in 1917 because they brought injured soldiers in to train them on the typing equipment, or sorry, the printmaking equipment. And then so in October of 1918, it comes back, the echo comes back, and there is mention of the flu, but it's sort of like, yeah, some kids had the flu, not a big deal. And there's very little detail. And there's some mention, children mentioning the flu, like one child talks about how sad it is what's happening in the United States, and he says 6,000 people in America are dying. I think it's a week, and he says, how horrible is that? And there's news about Winnipeg. There's a couple of people, and they check in with the deaf community in Winnipeg and mention that there's only really one member of the deaf community in the city who was actually quite ill, and his name was Mr. Tomlinson, and he recovered after about 10 days. But it's really interesting because, so using this source, I can actually really see within the institution, within the residential school, what the effect of the pandemic is, because as soon as there's a case, they lock the place down. They separate girls and boys in the dorms, and they isolate sick kids in the infirmary, Yet it still spreads like wildfire, and it ends up, the source says that something like 60 girls and 45 boys end up with influenza, but they're all mild cases. And so those are the sorts of things you can learn. I mean, analytically, it's really interesting to me because I see the school playing down the threat of the pandemic. The principal at the time, Howard McDermott, who was a doctor actually, and I see him, working to sort of to play this down, because they're assuring parents, right? You don't want to send out news to the parents and say, oh my God, 100 students have this illness and it's terrible. You want to project calm, right? Calm and control, and having that the situation is fine, it's going to pass, it's fine, right? So I look at this and I see that the school is not trying to alarm parents in the community, in the city and beyond, but there's also there's a sense of humor about it, which I find really interesting. And you see the same thing about the war around the same time, because the war is just ending at this point. There's very little mention of the war, and whenever there's mention of the war, it's often in the form of a joke, which I find really strange. But I guess a student newspaper, you don't really want to deal with the horrible, realities of things. So what I was going to say was, there's a piece in here that maybe you could try to bring up. Yeah, there it is. So there's this little poem here, and it says, Spain has through the centuries. I can't quite see because of the.
Oh, sorry. There you go.
Nope, that's okay. Anyway, it says, Spain has through the centuries gotten a considerable amount of free advertising in the form of Spanish Inquisition, Spanish Armada, Spanish fly, Spanish onion, Spanish eggs, and Spanish flu. So it's, a horrible thing, but they are sort of making, I don't want to say making light of it, but using humor to sort of get through bad times, which by 1918, with, the amount of war weariness in Canada at the time, that would have just been the way that a lot of people dealt with this ongoing tragedy that sort of became another tragedy, right? So,
well, I guess I don't know what you talk about in your social circles, but I know in my social circles on Instagram, on Facebook, we're throwing out a lot of, joke memes about 2020 and what a wonderful year it's been, really.
I'm wearing a bathing suit right now.
Pardon?
I'm wearing a bathing suit right now.
That's right, yeah. We're joking about it right now, and humor is a way to deal with kind of uncomfortable situations, especially situations where you really have lost all your bearings. And so it's kind of interesting to think too, if, for example, a teacher wanted to bring this into their classrooms and have the students create a newsletter just like these ones, would students think, oh yeah, let's put some memes in here, let's talk about a couple things that we're worried about, but not in these heavy ways, especially if you're not seeing your parents for a while, or if we should be really serious, really heavy. You know, I think, you know, when I looked at these sources that you sent me, I didn't read from it that they took a light approach.
Mhm.
But when you say that, it does make sense. And then when you think about why, it also makes sense, which is why these conversations are so great, because I think you are really highlighting something that maybe we would have missed, like thinking about how do you respond to something so difficult.
Mhm. And it's also important to remember, and I have to remind myself of this all the time, is that this is a time in which, yes, there's a ungodly flu epidemic happening, and it's killing a lot of people and making a lot of people sick. But I don't know that we can really draw a straight line from there to us, because that's a society that dealt with pandemics and dealt with epidemics a lot. Really serious childhood illness and adult illness, all kinds of things, polio, scarlet fever, rubella. These were all really damaging diseases. And this was not the only time that there was a lockdown at the Manitoba School for the Deaf. There was a scarlet fever outbreak in 1891, and a student died from it. Actually, there were not that many. There should have been more by rights, cramming 100 to 150 kids together. There were actually very few deaths, which I find remarkable. But this is a society that dealt with epidemics. That was part of life. Everyone would have known someone who got some kind of a communicable disease and got very sick or died from it or became deaf, or blind or whatever from it. So, yeah, I also read in these sources that there is sort of a seriousness when they're talking about these are the measures that we took. And okay, all the theaters in Winnipeg are closed and we're not allowed to leave the school, these sorts of things. That is serious, but it doesn't have this kind of shocked, I don't know how to put it, like the way that we deal with the current pandemic. I mean, I still find it really hard to understand, because I can't put that anywhere. I've never experienced anything like this in my life. And I'm sure you haven't either.
I think of this academic article that I read by a historian by the name of Jennifer Bonnell, and we're kind of friends, and so we were having dinner around the time she was publishing it, and so we were talking about it, and she was talking about this living history museum in Toronto, but it could be anywhere, and the different narratives they kind of put forward. And she was like, the family that lived in this house would have experienced death every year, and that isn't a part of our narrative of 19th century life. And this isn't a source from the 19th century, but what I'm hearing from you is a very similar thing. Like we're thinking people are responding in the same kind of milieu that we are in now, but people in generations before would be a lot closer to death. That doesn't mean it's any less difficult to deal with. In fact, during World War I, it would have been even more difficult because of the amount of people that were dying and the amount, like that whole generation. But that this was something that there was more resiliency or more maybe coping strategies. There wasn't the shock of it.
Yeah. I mean, there would have been, I mean, it's tough for me to say, right? Because I can't put myself in those shoes. But this is a society, and when I say this, I mean, early 20th century Winnipeg, let's say. And I'm way overgeneralizing here, but I think I'm on somewhat solid ground in saying this. This is a society that does not assume that it has the same kind of control over life and death than we do, right? And it's great. Thank God we have vaccinations and all this. It's wonderful, right? So, when something like COVID-19 happens, we, I think, find ourselves thinking, how could this happen? We're done with this stuff.
Right.
We overcame. We have, and it's hard for us to recognize that actually there are things that we don't really have control over, either personally or politically or as a country or whatever, as a city. It's jarring, right? And it wouldn't have been as jarring for these students and for the people sort of like writing in this paper, I think.
Yeah, and that really leads me to think of something else, because some of the writing that I've done is about kind of like lowercase l liberal notions of history and the discipline of history, and how we can kind of get so bound in there that we don't recognize there's other ways to think about the world and the past. And one of the attributes of lowercase l history is progress. That like that is the narrative. Like things were bad in the past, and now things are better in the present. And so, one of the things I'm hearing from you is like this highlights to us kind of that difficulties of that narrative, because we have been trapped in that narrative of being like, it's progress, we've done this, we like that's in the past. And we can think about this moment in different ways, and when we look at sources like this, we can see a different approach to something that we are drawing similarities from, but isn't as kind of trapped into that progress narrative as we often kind of unintentionally bind ourselves to.
Yeah, and we don't want to, that's a really good point, because we don't want to have this like sort of roguish liberal sort of view of history that assumes that like things go from here to here and it's a straight line. I'm saying, what I'm saying is that, myself, I never really expected this, like the pandemic to happen. And it's quite shocking to see that we don't really have this kind of as much control as we thought we did. But of course, there are communities in Canada and outside of Canada that have been dealing with things like this, right? With tuberculosis outbreaks, with, HIV in the 1980s and 90s. I mean, so when I make these points, I'm also making a point about myself, that I am grew up middle class in Nova Scotia, and have never dealt with this kinds of stuff. I was never in a marginalized community. So yeah, it's important to say that too. So, but it also, I think it's shocking for those of us who haven't been marginalized, because all of a sudden we are coming to terms with something that a lot of people have come to terms with in the past and have dealt with constantly, right?
Yeah, and I interviewed Jeffrey Reum, who's a critical disability historian, for the Pandemic Pedagogy series. We talked in April. And he was like, this is a real moment of disablement in society, and it's easier for people who don't have disabilities to understand barriers to full equitable living that many disabled people face every single day. And it's interesting to be able to look at sources like this that identify elements in history that we often overlook, like disability history, or histories related to people who have disabilities or differently abled, in order to recognize this longer historical narrative and the ways that we in society generally have marginalized disabilities or people who are differently abled. So that kind of leads me to my last question about how this source challenges our vision or our notions of history of this particular period. But before I go to that question, I just want to flag one thing you had said earlier, because I don't know, maybe about 5 minutes ago, you said residential schools, and that was the first time we've said residential schools in this conversation. Yes. But if we were talking 7 years ago, we probably would say it a lot more, because residential schools is a type of school where people are residing, and now we associate residential schools with residential schools related to Indigenous people on this land and the Indian Act, but it is a type of school. So when you said residential schools, for example, you're not referring to the TRC.
No, I'm not referring to Indigenous residential schools. No, I simply mean it's a school where most of the students live.
Right.
And yeah. But one thing I'll say about the difference between deaf residential schools and residential schools for Indigenous children at the time is, one was a site of cultural destruction, right? And the other was the site of cultural formation, where deaf kids came together, learned sign language together, formed community, and then made bonds that they sort of brought with them for the rest of their lives. So yeah, they're both residential schools, but they're very, very, very different.
Yeah, and again, I think that language, we're just a little bit more aware of that language. But if we were talking 7 years ago, although I don't even know if Zoom was around, we probably both would have been using that phrase a lot more, because that is reflective of the type of school. We just have different associations with it right now. So I just wanted to clarify that.
No, thank you for flagging that. Yeah.
No, I mean, I also, when I was doing my introduction from you before you came on, I was like, oh, I don't know if I want to say residential school here. Yeah. So but it's good to make that distinction. Before we move on to that, how does this history challenge? Are there elements of these newsletters that you want to kind of highlight that I've been going around looking at a couple things while you're talking? do you want to talk about anything specific that like we can pull out? Like people can look on their own, obviously. I love this local news by the pupils because of like how basic the sentence structure is, like, because it's written by young people. And
kids, yeah.
I mean, I would love it if a teacher like replicated this type of newsletter with their students and what people would say. But it's interesting how the flu is here. Is there like, should we pull out anything specific? I don't even think I looked at one of the pages yet.
Aside from the things that we've talked about, it is interesting to see how the children sort of process how just how jarring it can be. So on the page that you were just on, there's one on the pupils page. There's one student who has written something about how, where is it? It's down a little bit. If you can scroll down below LCA's, I think it's Annie Gayski, Lucy Creighton, where she says, there's she talks about a returned soldier who's arrived at the school because he lost his hearing because of an illness in England. And she has Lucy doesn't really do this, but many of the students will have something very just important to their lives, like we got 2 new baseball bats, or we played hockey yesterday, or like we're really hoping that the ponds are going to freeze over so we can. And then the next sentence will be something like Lucy says, there was a terrible disaster last week when the CPR assessed the Princess Sophia disaster, right? In the where I can't remember actually where, but anyway, on the Pacific coast, how they process these kinds of really horrible things and will just juxtapose them together. Like, it's quite a jarring reading, especially I've read every issue from 1891 to 1931. So that's a lot of issues. The ones that exist, most of them exist. And it's just reading history and big events through the lens of kids and how they don't really have the same kind of sort of hierarchies of importance than that we do, right? That's the thing that one of the things that I find really fascinating. You really do, I think, get this voice of I don't want to say like the voice of childhood, but I look at the way that this is structured and I can think about, myself when I was a kid, or, the children that I know now, how they might organize and how they might just sort of look at something and be like, oh, okay, and then move on, right? In a way that perhaps adults wouldn't, right? If that makes sense.
For sure. Yeah. And, in the teachers that I've spoke to for the pandemic pedagogy series, the ones where we're talking about history generally and history teaching, a lot of them talk about like, get your students to create your own archive. And like one of the things, and like one teacher, Diane Valtour, she had said that one of her students was like, I don't have anything to say. I'm just sitting in the basement playing video games. And she's like, record that. Yeah. And for some students, like this period is going to have very different, less stressful memories than ours as adults. Like that they did this excellent job on a particular video game, or that their parents were around all the time and they didn't get to go to school. And like, I think as adults and educators, it's important for us to remember that young people are going to be taking different things from this moment than we are as adults that read the news and can't get away from the news and are making decisions about young people's lives. And I like this type of source demonstrates that from this historical perspective, because one of the things that struck me too about this particular page was for Elsie or Elise at the beginning, and she said like, Dolly said she was coming back to school. Freda said she's not sure if she's coming back to school this winter. And like, those are decisions that parents are making right now. Like Dolly and Freda probably wasn't making those decisions unilaterally, no. But it's kind of interesting how it's talked about. It isn't with this same weight that parents are like, I don't know what to do. And so thanks for bringing that up about that voice, kind of that, yeah, like you don't want to say childish voice, but it
No,
is or childlike, but the voice of children in this
yeah,
allows us to see it differently.
it's just crossing another type of distance for me
Yeah.
personally anyway, right? You know, it's always really fun to see what kind of bridges you can build when you're looking at a source like this, or
Yeah.
try to build, right?
Yeah, and thank you. And that's one of the reasons why this series is so great, because I mean, even someone like myself who has studied history, I often, you know, it's kind of the same with artwork. So I read this study a few years ago that said people at an art museum don't spend usually more than like 15 seconds at a piece of artwork. And this art teacher said, I want you to spend 15 minutes with a piece of artwork and track your journey. And so for me, although I didn't necessarily think of that while doing this series, that's what's so great about these conversations, because we can spend a little bit more time bringing things up. And how something like they're disappointed because we can't do our Halloween plans is something that people are thinking about right now.
It's gonna be a big deal in a couple of weeks, right?
Yeah. No, thank you. This is great. So how does this source and this history challenge our ideas about this historical period, or even just the period, like just the past? How can we challenge and bring this source into our classrooms in a way that's a counter story to the grand narrative of Canada?
Well, I mean, there is the sort of the project of deaf and disability history that tries to sort of, you know, push back this idea that, push back on this idea that disability is sort of immutable and is sort of the same throughout time, and that people who are disabled in the past lived these horrible marginalized lives. Some of them did, right? But it's also really important to just not focus on that. It's really important to focus on individuals and individual groups of people who did live super full lives, right? And advocated for themselves and had friends and relationships and, you know, transnational sort of connections to people in different countries. And I mean, it's important to remember, one thing that I like to say is that we have to remember that disability is a verb. Disability is not a noun. That's a really important point. People are disabled. That's why I personally, and it's fine, like there's a lot of nomenclature around disability and people should use what they feel comfortable using. I don't say people with disabilities, because that's a bit of a liberal way of saying that the disability takes the person, right? Whereas when you say disabled people, it points to the fact that they themselves are disabled by society, right? You know, so let's say curbside pickup, new for me, right? Wasn't new for someone, for a wheelchair user, right? Of course. So it's sort of like Jeffrey's very good point, that this is a disabling moment for a lot of us. And I hope that people are internalizing that. I'm not sure that they are. So yeah, that's what I would say, is trying to get over this idea that in the past, disability only meant oppression. It certainly did, but it didn't only mean oppression. It's really important to pay attention to individual people and recognize that they were full people with interests and abilities just like ours, right? That's what I would say.
I think that's really great, and I think it's important to be able to think of the diversity of people in the past.
Yeah.
You know, it's very easy to think that, well, if diversity didn't look like this diversity in 21st century Canada, it wasn't the same. It didn't have the same type of weight. And that's not true. And there's so many elements of people's experiences that often are not brought into the classroom as like, this is a way we can understand this particular moment. It's just like off to the side. And so thank you for bringing this to the conversation, to center this history in thinking about the Spanish flu.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's wonderful.
I also just want to, before we say goodbye, I also just want to, as a point of like summary, just highlights too some of the challenges that we talked about related to that, about these kind of intra-provincial movements, and about how activism and how this moment kind of intersect at certain points. Like, it's not a clear A to B, but there's like connect the dots in there, which is something I talked to Sean Carleton about the Winnipeg General Strike, and about how we can look at some of these histories from histories related to disabled people and also youth, as a way to think about the different impacts. And I'm so thankful that you digitized this source for us to share, because I think it's going to be really valuable in people's classrooms. So thanks so much, Sandy. This was wonderful.
Yeah, it was wonderful. Thanks.
Thank you. And we'll be in touch. Any of the information that you want to share that you think would be relevant to teachers will be below the YouTube video, and the sources are available on the website as well. So thank you so much, and we'll be in touch.
Yeah, thanks.
Bye.
Bye.